this and where those areas often intersect, really for the last 12 years. And I'll share more about my professional background and academic background as we go on. But yeah, today we're really going to be focusing on, as Brett kind of set up for us, LGBT identity, equity, some steps that folks can take to be an ally to the queer community, and really thinking about, how do we celebrate Pride beyond Pride Month, so beyond just June, right? Like, how do we plug in to these other opportunities like LGBT History Month in October, like Transgender Awareness Month next month, Transgender Day of Remembrance, which is also happening next month in November. So really being intentional about thinking about how we can celebrate and uplift LGBT folks year round. So with that, like I said, I'll introduce myself a little more, share a bit about my story as a Black queer transgender person and kind of how I got into doing the work I do today. Really naming kind of like why this conversation matters, particularly in the context of 2022. So really thinking about, celebrating LGBT history as it is the end of LGBT History Month. But also, for you all as a social services organization that primarily works to get people housed and support people in finding, safe, affordable, stable housing, really wanted to spend some time talking about, how this issue impacts the LGBT community in a very specific and unfortunately disproportionate way. And then really ending with some action steps. So we'll kind of define, equity and inclusion a little more, and I'll share out some best practices that you all can take as individuals, but also kind of thinking more as an organization at Compass Point or wherever else you may work. What are some steps your organization can take to really center LGBT folks year round? And then hopefully at the end, we have some time for Q&A. I would love to hear from you all, obviously. Really want to make sure that folks are getting, what they feel like they need and want out of this conversation. Oh, there's an echo. That's interesting. I don't know what happened there for a second, but it seems like the echo went away. Okay, so yeah, and then ending with some Q&A. Again, really want, you all to feel like you get what you want and need out of this space. So feel free to, drop any questions in the chat as I'm talking. Rhett will kind of keep those in order, and that way when we get to the Q&A, we can kind of dive into them. And also feel free to come off mute once we get to that Q&A portion to ask your questions out loud. So I always like kind of start these presentations with a quote. It's just, it helps me kind of like ground in the space. And I think it's kind of a good way to like introduce myself to folks a little more. So one of my kind of like heroes and possibility models, if you will, is James Baldwin. For those of you that aren't familiar with James Baldwin, he was a Black queer writer. He was a poet. He was a novelist. He also is very well known for his work witnessing the civil rights movement. So he often talked about himself not as a civil rights activist per se, but as a witness to that. So anyways, he has this quote that says, "Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it's faced." And this is kind of the quote that I have always tried to live my life by. And definitely, in this work, when we're thinking about racial equity, when we're thinking about inclusion, when we're thinking about how do we build more diverse and welcoming organizations, I always like to start with this, right? Because you can't, this sounds really cliche, but you can't solve a problem until you're able to name that problem, right? And address that problem, whether that's different systems of oppression that we see at play in our lives, in our organizations, in our society, or just, thinking about, the kind of cultures we want to build. Like, you can't really start that conversation unless you're able to really be willing and able to address the work ahead, right? So I always like to start in that. It's something that I ground in, and when I'm working with clients, I like to kind of ground them in that mindset as well. So another thing that I think is really important to start with when we're thinking about like diversity, equity, and inclusion, when we're thinking about how do we build equitable organizations, when we're thinking about like how do we celebrate LGBT people, is really naming that like all of us kind of have what I like to call kind of core identities or foundational identities, right? So oftentimes, if you go to a DEI kind of 101 workshop, the first thing that people will talk about is like unconscious bias or implicit bias, right? If that resonates with you, like, give me a thumbs up or like raise your hand if like you've been in one of those workshops before, right? And that's typically where we start. And I don't start there, and I don't like starting there. And the reason why I don't start with unconscious bias or implicit bias, or even honestly really talk about it that much in my work, not gonna lie, is because in my experience, I have found that, yes, bias is a problem. I'm not saying it's not a problem, But what I am saying is that at the core of why people have biases, right, it's because we don't really understand our own identities oftentimes, particularly the ways our identities interact and intersect with our coworkers' identities, with our colleagues' identities. And like what I mean by that is like all of us have some level of proximity to power and privilege based on who we are, right? Based on those core identities. We also, you know, those core identities that we have also have dramatically shaped our life experiences, right? So like, for example, my life experience as like a person is very much driven by being Black. It's very much driven by being queer. It's very much driven by being trans. It's very much driven by being from the South and being autistic, right? And the places where all of those things intersect. So I always like to start with talking about my own foundational identities, but also kind of welcome you all as we talk today, welcome you all as you engage in DEI work at your various organizations to really think about like your own core identities, right? Like what makes Brett, what makes Connie, what makes Greg, right? Like what makes you who you are, and how does bringing that to the table and like your daily work life really impact, you know, the ways that you can or cannot show up at your organization. So that being said, yeah, for me, like these are definitely kind of like my core identities. I especially think about being Black, queer, and trans and from the South, particularly in this moment of LGBT History Month, because it's very easy for folks to forget or to not know or to write off the South when we think about LGBT advocacy and organizing work, when in reality, you know, the South actually has the highest concentration of LGBT people of color in the whole country. So, you know, that part of the story doesn't really get told a lot, doesn't get publicized a lot. People think of the South as this very backwards racist place, very backwards homophobic place or transphobic place, when in reality, Black, queer people have always existed, particularly in the South, right? And there's a really strong history of that. So I think that's really like critical for myself, just personally, but also to name in the context of this conversation. And then another thing that I always kind of like to welcome people to think about when they're, you know, thinking about equity at their own organization or how they engage with DEI work is the fact that I'm autistic, right? And that's something that's like newer for me. I was diagnosed like 2 or 3 years ago. And honestly, being diagnosed was like the best thing that ever happened to me personally, because it made a lot of my life make sense. And since being diagnosed as being autistic, it has really like opened up a whole new world for myself and like a new level of self-joy, like just like love and joy for myself. And I say that because, you know, I think when we think about disabilities, a lot of times we think very specifically about like physical disabilities, right? Or people that might use like mobility aids, like scooters or wheelchairs or canes, where it's more like obvious, quote unquote, that they're disabled. And a lot of times people who are neurodivergent, so whether you're autistic, whether you're ADD, whether you're ADHD, you know, we're left out of that conversation around disability. And again, thinking about how none of our identities live in silos, right? Like, so all of our identities, regardless of who you are, really intersect. And I think a lot about my experience as a kid, you know, being a Black girl, quote unquote, like being raised as a girl, right? Black girls, particularly in the late 90s, early 2000s, when I was a child, were not being diagnosed with autism, right? Autism was always thought to kind of like look one way. It was very much diagnosed in like white boys who were obsessed with trains when they were 4 years old. And that was kind of like the criteria for autism for a long time. And that left out a lot of people of color. It left out a lot of queer folks, right? So again, thinking about all of the ways my own identities have intersected, but for you all in your own lives, just keeping that in mind, right? Like that none of your identities really live in silos. So like by nature of my identity, it really led me to this journey of doing advocacy work, which was never really part of the plan, to be clear. Growing up, I wanted to be an author and a WNBA player. I never foresaw being an activist of any sorts when I was a kid or a teenager. But that all really changed when I went to college. I started college, I should say, at a very small school in East Tennessee. This was back in 2011. And, you know, now we have seen in the last year or two a lot of national media attention around a lot of the anti-LGBT bills that are popping up all over the country. I don't know how familiar you are you all are with that, but there's been over 200 anti-LGBT bills that have been introduced across state legislators this year alone. And most of those bills are targeting transgender people or their parents or healthcare providers for trans people. And I bring this up because, now this is a big national topic. But back in 2011, when I was starting college at a very small school in East Tennessee, nobody was really talking about anti-LGBT bills or anti-LGBT harassment on any sort of national level. And I started this work because that year in Tennessee, where I went to college, the state legislator was trying to pass, I think 15 or 16 anti-LGBT bills back in 2011 across Tennessee, including the original anti-trans bathroom bill, which unfortunately was started in Tennessee the year I was in college there. So kind of by default of being the only trans person on my very tiny college campus, I started, getting involved with the GSA. I was really looking for queer community. I had never really had that before growing up as a teenager outside of Charlotte, North Carolina. Long story short, a professor kind of found me on campus and took me under her wing. She was very much like the P-flag mom. She had 2 queer kids and did all of the activism. And I started doing some local organizing work with high school students in East Tennessee, helping them start GSAs. We started going to Nashville, which is the state capital, a couple of times a month and lobbying against these anti-LGBT bills and sharing our stories. So that's really how this all started for me back in 2011. And, since then, I've had the opportunity to work at national organizations in DC, such as the National Center for Transgender Equality, the Gay, Lesbian, Straight Education Network, the National LGBTQ Task Force, and many other organizations really primarily focus on these 4 issue areas. So racial justice, LGBTQ equity, education equity, and doing a lot of work specifically with LGBT youth and also youth of color. So thinking about undocumented youth, Black and Brown youth and their experiences as well. And kind of similarly, I don't have that slide. I thought I did. Sorry, I thought I had a slide and I didn't. So kind of similarly to how our identities don't live in silos. None of this work lives in silos either. And I really want to name that because I think again it's easy to see these 4 issue areas separate on a slide and think, oh, these are all separate things. But really, a lot of my work has been really intersectional throughout my entire life and throughout my entire career. So a really great example of this is when I was working at GLSEN, the Gay, Lesbian, Straight Education Network, back in 2013, 2014. There was a lot of conversation in education policy circles back then about the school to prison pipeline, which basically the idea of the school to prison pipeline is talking about how Black and Brown students typically are over punished in schools for very minor infractions, and that pushes them out of schools and starts their interaction with law enforcement at a very young age. And oftentimes that ends up that they end up in juvenile facilities, which then leads them ending up in adult facilities later on. And so there was a lot of research about that starting in 2010, 2011, again, specifically as impact on Black and Brown youth, but nobody was really talking about the school to prison pipeline in terms of LGBT youth. There was just starting to be some research around 2013, 2014, and nobody was having a conversation about how it intersected in terms of LGBT youth of color, right? So when I worked at GLSEN, for example, I started doing some of that early research on the school to prison pipeline and its impact specifically on LGBT youth of color. So really combining the education equity lens with the racial justice lens with the LGBT identity, obviously. So that's one example of some of that intersectional work I've done. And in addition to doing work at the federal level, I also have been really involved with state and local LGBT organizing throughout the years. So in Massachusetts, when I was an undergraduate student in Boston, I was also on the Massachusetts Commission of LGBTQ Youth on their policy committee. And we really, were thinking about how can the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, through state agencies, through state laws, support LGBT youth across Massachusetts. So that's a little bit of some of the work I've done specifically in the LGBT space. And more recently, I started Swarm Strategy. So again, that was back in June 2020. I really wanted to take my experience doing LGBT advocacy across different levels. I also am a former high school history teacher. So I taught high school for a couple of years in Oakland, California and Providence, Rhode Island, predominantly really thinking about how do we teach the histories of historically marginalized and underrepresented communities across the United States. So I wanted to kind of take all my experience in education equity and teaching and LGBT policy and advocacy and doing racial equity work, and also having a lived experience being a Black queer trans person, and figure out a way to put it all together to support organizations and companies like Compass and like other organizations that y'all work at, to really, build organizations that work for everybody. Because quite frankly, workplaces and companies have never really worked for people from marginalized communities, right? And when I say people from marginalized communities, I'm talking about LGBT folks, I'm talking about people of color, but I'm also talking about people with disabilities, immigrants, women, right? Basically anyone whose identities are outside of the quote unquote norm, right? People who have been pushed to the side simply because of our identity. So I started Swarm with that in mind a couple of years ago. I'm really focusing on social change and equity, building inclusive organizations, doing organizational design work, and writing human-centered policies, right? Because that's the other thing, is a lot of policies in our workplaces are actually not like written with us in mind, right? They're written to serve the company, they're written to protect the company, but they're not actually written like to serve the people in those organizations, right? So that's really where Swarm started from. And since then, I've had the chance to work with a really wide variety of clients. I've worked with over 25 clients at this point over the last couple of years, ranging from, small to mid-sized tech companies, like Storyblocks, for example, to more established, really big tech companies like Microsoft. I've also worked with beauty and cosmetic brands, which is pretty funny as someone who's a trans guy and grew up like a mega tomboy and was never into makeup or anything like that. But, I've gotten to work with like Fenty by Rihanna, for example, Fenty Beauty, Fenty Skin. But I also work with a lot of nonprofits, and my heart is honestly still really in like the nonprofit world. So a lot of my clients have also been like reproductive healthcare nonprofits. I still do work with LGBT nonprofits in a consulting capacity. And when Rhett approached me about working with you all, I was really excited because, again, thinking about intersectionality, I really see the work that you all do as touching so many marginalized communities in particular. So I know I've said a lot, so I wanted to just kind of take a moment to really kind of like define what it means to be transgender, because I know I've used that word a couple of times to describe myself and my own identity. And again, it being LGBT History Month, I really want to highlight, the trans community, because we are often left out of conversations, even in LGBT spaces. And, want you all to walk away with maybe a new understanding of a term or an identity. So I'm going to take a second to kind of break down just like what it means to be trans. And in order to do this, I'm going to use an analogy. And full disclosure, I did not come up with this analogy. My dear friend and colleague, Ben Green, did. He is also a fabulous trans DEI facilitator and expert. And Ben, I have his permission to use this, and I always give him a shout out. And I will share these slides with Rhett afterwards, and Rhett will be able to share them with everyone on this call. So the reason for that is I have a lot of like resources like linked throughout the presentation that I want you all to have access to, including Ben's TED Talk. So definitely after this workshop or later today, if you want to learn more about this analogy and kind of hear more about Ben's story, you can click this link at the bottom and it will take you to his TED Talk. So with that being said, Ben came up with this really great analogy to kind of break down what it means to be trans. And like, full disclosure, analogies are obviously oversimplified, right? That is like the entire point of an analogy. So like, this is not like a super scientific necessarily like definition or breakdown of what it means to be transgender. But what I do think it is it makes it like really accessible for folks at all levels to kind of conceptualize, okay, well, like, what does it mean to be trans, right? So first and foremost, when we're thinking about gender, there's kind of two parts to this. There's our gender expression, which is like how we outwardly show our gender. So thinking about gender expression, it's the way that like you outwardly express who you are in terms of your gender to the rest of the world. So it really, is about like feeling confident and comfortable, right? And how you express your gender. And typically people express their gender through their clothing, right? So, you can see I am wearing like a long sleeve button down shirt with a collar. It's typically more quote unquote masculine. I'm wearing like this dark gray t-shirt, right? So you express your gender through your clothing, you express your gender through your mannerisms, the way you talk, the tone of your voice, like all of these things are outward expressions of our gender. And everyone has a gender expression, some form of gender expression and a gender identity, right? Regardless of whether or not you're transgender, everyone expresses their gender in specific ways. So that's what gender expression is about. Gender identity is about how you feel internally, right? So think about expression as like outward, how I present myself, how people see me based on how I present myself. And identity is like inward. So thinking about how you see yourself, your personal experiences, and how everything that you've got experienced and feel inside represents your gender, right? So for most people, their gender expression and gender identity aligns, right? Meaning they are the same. Meaning, I'm gonna pick on Rhett for a second. I hope that's okay. So like Rhett, you know, you express your gender pretty outwardly in a masculine way. Would you agree with that?
Yes.
And then like internally, like how would you describe your gender identity?
I would assign it the same. I'd say masculine.
Yeah, right. So you were cisgender then, right? Meaning that it's an adjective that describes a person whose gender identity aligns with the sex they were assigned at birth, right? So going to the chair analogy here, we have two chairs. We have a bar stool, then we kind of have like a more cozy living room chair. So if someone's cisgender, let's say you're born into this bar stool chair right here, right? And you're born into your chair, you sit in your chair when you're born, and you're like, oh yeah, this chair is great. I feel super comfortable. I can like lay back, I can get cozy. This is a great chair for me, right? This chair fits who I am. So most people have that experience, right? You are born and you know, you are in your chair and you're like, oh yes, this chair is perfect for me. So if that's true for you, you are cisgender, right? So again, if you're a language nerd at all, cis is just the Latin root for same. So cisgender means that your gender is the same, essentially, right, as your birth sex. So that is what it means to be cisgender. Versus if you're transgender, or sometimes you'll see this as an shortened to just say trans, right? Trans is an adjective used to describe someone whose gender identity is different from their sex assigned at birth, right? So for example, myself, as someone who is trans-masculine, you know, I like to joke all the time that when I was born, the doctor lifted me in the air like baby Simba and said, it's a girl, right? And I always joke, I wish I could meet that doctor and be like, you were wrong, who knew? Right? Because I do not identify as a girl. So while yes, my birth sex was female, right? Based on what a doctor assigned me, based on my body parts as a baby, right? I do not identify as female. So again, thinking about the chair analogy, right? For a lot of transgender people, let's say, you know, I was born into this bar stool that I'm sitting in, and I was just like, you know what? This chair is not very comfortable. I don't particularly like this chair. It doesn't really work for me. You know, it's a fine chair probably for anybody else, but I can't really like, this chair is really uncomfortable. So I actually, you know, want to go sit over here instead in this very nice cozy orange armchair. I don't know if you can see it behind me. And oh man, this chair feels so much better. It's just like more my style, more my speed. I feel like I can be myself. I feel like I can kind of take a deep breath and slow down. So, you know, for transgender people, think about it as like, I was born into the bar stool and I don't particularly like the bar stool. And I think, you know, this orange cozy chair fits me much better. And then gender exists on the spectrum, right? So I think people want gender to be this very clean cut, black and white thing, and it's just not, right? Because no part of our identity is really clean cut or black and white, whether we're talking about gender or, you know, other aspects. So it really does exist on this like broader spectrum, right? And the idea of the gender spectrum is that, you know, there is so much more than just being a man or being a woman, right? So think about gender as kind of like a continuum rather than like these little boxes that we like to put people in, right? And some people fall more toward masculine or feminine aspects, and some kind of like move fluidly along this spectrum, you know, and some exist kind of off the spectrum entirely, and that's okay too. So, you know, thinking about this, like, you know, if we went to a furniture store, like, are there just going to be bar stools and armchairs there? No, there are tons of other types of chairs in the world, right? Besides bar stools and armchairs. Could you imagine if we only had bar stools and armchairs in the world? Going to the movies would be very weird. We couldn't sit on couches with people. We only had these bar stools and armchairs, and like that was it, right? So gender is kind of the same, right? There's so much more than just bar stools and armchairs. There's dining room chairs, there's office chairs on wheels, there's couches, there's movie theater chairs, there's all different kinds of chairs, right? So some people are non-binary, which you might see abbreviated as NB. And non-binary is a term that can be used to describe people who don't really see their gender as fitting into the category of man or woman, right? So sometimes non-binary people, will kind of identify as a little bit of both. Sometimes non-binary people will just say, hey, this is just who I am. And like, that's okay too. And there are a bunch of different terms you might hear to refer to non-binary folks. You might hear gender queer. That's kind of like one of the old school terms going back to like the early to mid 2000s. But yeah, there are gender fluid is another one you might hear. There are different terms to describe non-binary folks. So again, going back to our handy dandy chair analogy, today's Monday, and maybe on Monday, this nice orange armchair feels good to me. But maybe tomorrow I'll wake up and I'll be like, you know what? I do not like this armchair anymore. I'm actually going to go sit in this other bar stool, this cork bar stool right here. And this chair feels way better to me tomorrow. Or maybe, I will wake up next week and I'll be like, hey, I hate this cork bar stool and I hate this orange armchair. I kind of don't want any of the chairs. And I just want to stand up. And that's okay too, right? So non-binary people, their gender is often more fluid or it shifts. And a lot of non-binary folks do use gender-neutral pronouns, but not all non-binary folks do. So a lot of folks that use they, them pronouns may also identify as non-binary. So yeah, before I get into like why it matters, I do want to pause to see if there are any questions just about any of the terminology. Yes, there's like any of the terminology in particular, because I think that's like really important, especially moving forward.
Feel free to drop your questions in the chat or come off mute and you can talk to Bryce directly.
Yeah.
Bryce, no questions in the chat?
Cool. All right. Well, I hope that means that Ben's analogy was useful then.
Yes. We have a lot of folks saying you're crushing it and truly agree. Keep it going.
Cool. Awesome. So yeah, now that we've kind of like, I've shared a little bit about my work and my background, we've defined like what it means to be transgender and some other key terms like gender spectrum and non-binary. I really do want to spend some time talking about like why this matters, especially in 2022, because you might be sitting here being like, oh, this is great, Bryce, but like, it's 2022, like, we've got LGBT marriage rights. We have like, we've made so much progress these last couple decades. Like I live in the Bay Area, I live in San Francisco. It's so progressive here. Like, why do we need to talk about this? So yeah, I just wanted to like really provide some more context kind of like behind the why. And I meant to actually say this in my introduction, so I totally failed at that, but I actually lived in the Bay for 4 years. I lived in Oakland from July 2017 up until last April 2021. So I have a lot of context of this work specifically in the Bay Area, right? Thinking about the work you all do at Compass with unhoused folks and people facing housing insecurity. I have faced that in my life first and foremost. I've been homeless technically and in couch surfed and stayed with friends and like had that experience as an LGBT person, which is very common for a lot of queer folks, which like I'll talk about more in a second. But also like I have witnessed how this plays out in very specific ways in the Bay, right? Thinking about San Francisco proper, but also in the East Bay. So I meant to say that in my intro, that I live in the Bay. I have some context for the work you all do and for the place you're in. And I really just like appreciate the work that you all are doing every day, particularly for those of you that are at Compass. So with that being said, it is LGBT History Month. I did just tell you I live in the Bay, so I would be remiss to not mention some of the really rich cultural history that exists in the San Francisco Bay Area in particular. And of course, I want to be clear, LGBT people have made contributions across the country for centuries, right? For decades. I'm really focusing on San Francisco, the Bay Area specifically because you all are based there, right? And really want to kind of give you all a more like recent kind of LGBT history of the place that so many of you call home. So like acknowledging that like I'm going to go over a very brief period of time in a very specific place, but LGBT Americans have really made contributions across the board for centuries. So with that in mind, I actually was in San Francisco a couple weeks ago. And when I flew into San Francisco, my favorite part of flying into SFO, because I usually do not really like SFO as an airport overall, but the one part of SFO that I do really love and enjoy is the Harvey Milk Terminal. And it's always really nice whenever I land in San Francisco to be reminded of the power of Harvey Milk as a person and everything he brought to the San Francisco Bay Area in such a short time. So for those of you not familiar with Harvey Milk, he was a visionary, civil and human rights leader. He became one of the first openly gay elected officials in the US when he won his race for the Board of Supervisors in 1977. And really at the time of his untimely death, he was assassinated in 1978. He was one of the biggest rising political stars, not just in San Francisco or not just in California, but really nationally. Many people thought that he would go on to become, the first openly gay senator, the first openly gay president, even perhaps. He was very much like a rising star in politics when he was murdered. And he was targeted and murdered because of his sexuality and because of his very public activism work that he had dedicated his life to. So prior to him moving to San Francisco, he was actually a Navy veteran. So again, he served in the military at a time where, as an openly gay man, that was very much like looked down upon and very much shunned. And he was eventually forced out of the military, even though he had an impeccable service record, was a naval officer, was very, very good at his job, but he was forced out because of his sexuality. But he went on to be successful at everything he did. So he was a public school teacher, he was a stock analyst, he worked on Broadway, and then eventually he made his way to San Francisco in 1972, where he opened a camera shop in the Castro. And because of his small business, because of his very charismatic personality, he quickly became a leader in the Castro neighborhood, which, I'm sure many of you know, the Castro is a historically gay neighborhood that still is very much queer-friendly, queer-centered in San Francisco. And he really quickly established himself as a leader in the Castro. Again, he, eventually won a seat on the Board of Supervisors, and many saw him kind of as an up-and-coming star when he was unfortunately assassinated. So, I mentioned the airport exhibit a little earlier, and definitely I would encourage you all, if you're ever taking a flight in or out of SFO, just spend some time looking at his exhibit in Terminal 1, the Harvey Milk Terminal. It really is, as a historian and someone who has studied public history and done this work in terms of public museums, it's one of the best I have seen in terms of a public history exhibit really telling someone's story. So Harvey Milk is probably one of the most well-known, if not the most well-known kind of figure when we think about San Francisco LGBT history, right? Another really pivotal moment that happened in San Francisco in 1966 was the Compton Cafeteria riot. So if any of you are familiar with the Tenderloin, Gene Compton's Cafeteria used to be a very well-known landmark in the Tenderloin neighborhood in San Francisco. And a lot of people do not know about the Compton Cafeteria riots. And instead, Stonewall, which happened in New York City in 1969, is usually cited as kind of the first gay uprising or first LGBT uprising, when in reality, the Compton Cafeteria riots actually happened 3 years before Stonewall in San Francisco. So Gene Compton's Cafeteria was really a late night 24-hour kind of spot, again, in the Tenderloin. The Tenderloin's reputation over the past decades has not changed that much. Even back in the 60s, the Tenderloin was a hotbed for sex work, for illegal gambling, for illegal drug use. It's kind of always been San Francisco's red light district, right? That's true now, it was true then. And Gene Compton's Cafeteria was really at the center of that. And it was known as a community gathering spot for a lot of the women that worked in that area, or people that were drag queens, or people that were transgender, or people that were gay men, but were very effeminate and who engaged in sex work. So Gene Compton's Cafeteria was kind of the center of that universe. And a lot of those people would gather there after work or between shifts. It was really close to other local businesses and coffee shops that were very popular amongst the trans and queer community. So yeah, it was just kind of the center of that universe. But unfortunately, the owners and the management of Gene Compton's Cafeteria did not want it to have that reputation. They didn't want it to be known as the place that sex workers hung out, or transgender women hung out, or that drag queens hung out. So oftentimes they would call the police on these folks who were just trying to find a space of their own, right? Who just wanted to carve out a small piece of the neighborhood for themselves. But more frequently than not, they were harassed by the employees there and also harassed by the San Francisco Police Department. So, you know, finally one night they all just kind of said, enough is enough. And the San Francisco police came to unlawfully arrest and detain a group of trans women, a group of drag queens, a group of gay sex workers, and they fought back and they stood up for their rights. And unfortunately, the actual cafeteria is no longer there, but you can still go to that part of the Tenderloin, and there's a plaque kind of commemorating the cafeteria uprising. Another lesser known kind of like big historical moment that happened in San Francisco that people don't think about. If you know about it, you don't think about it in the context of queer history, but I wanted to bring it in because I think it's like a really important story. So in 1977, there was a huge disability justice rights movement in San Francisco and across the Bay. I don't know if any of you know this, but like Berkeley, California, and particularly just across the Bay Bridge, Berkeley, it was and still is the epicenter of like disability rights organizing communities starting in the 60s and 70s. And again, that's still true today because Berkeley was actually one of the first cities to install wheelchair ramps and create actual accessible spaces for people with physical disabilities. But San Francisco was also a really big part of this story. So in 1977, a group of activists actually occupied the San Francisco Federal Building for 26 days. It's still the longest occupation of a federal building in United States history. And the reason why they were protesting and ultimately occupied the federal building for 26 days was because they wanted the federal government to actually implement Section 504. So Section 504 was the first federal civil rights law specifically focused on people with disabilities. And the idea behind Section 504 was that it would mandate that any business or office or any space that got federal funding had to make their building or office or space accessible to folks with disabilities, right? And the law was passed years and years and years before this, but it was never funded and it was never enforced. So even though the law was technically passed, nothing had actually changed. So a group of disability rights activists in San Francisco decided, hey, we're going to do something about this. So the reason why I named this in the context of queer history is because the disability justice movement has always been the most diverse and intersectional civil rights movement of all time. So, you know, while this group was being led by people with disabilities, many of them were LGBTQ. A lot of them identified as queer. They also had really broad support from other like local organizing groups and local communities in the Bay Area. So most historically well known as probably the Black Panther Party actually partnered with the Section 504 sit-in protesters and cooked food for them, provided them with blankets and free meals for weeks and weeks on end. And there were also a lot of LGBT, like kind of grassrootsy organizing groups in the San Francisco Bay Area that supported the Section 504 sit-in protesters with other resources as well. And then to kind of finally, you know, I think probably the most infamous, well-known piece of, you know, LGBT history, particularly in San Francisco, is the HIV/AIDS crisis, right? Which we really saw start hitting the community in the 80s and 90s. And you know, when people often talk about the HIV/AIDS crisis in the 80s and the 90s, particularly in San Francisco, they typically focus on, you know, the tens of thousands of lives that were lost, you know, the lack of federal government response, kind of focusing on all of the negatives that came out of the HIV/AIDS crisis and just like the mass deaths that occurred. We lost an entire generation of predominantly gay men, but also trans women, also sex workers. An entire generation was lost to the HIV/AIDS crisis in San Francisco alone, right? That's like not counting New York City, not counting other places. But, you know, the part that I really want to focus on with you all today and really want to like uplift is that out of that crisis came so many beautiful examples of community organizing and community care and advocacy groups that many of which are still around today and still very active in the San Francisco Bay Area and nationwide, right? So probably the most well-known HIV/AIDS organization is ACT UP. ACT UP had very, no pun intended, active chapters, particularly in San Francisco and New York City. ACT UP was known as a revolutionary, disruptive civil rights organization. They did very radical, what seemed at the time to be very radical protests including throwing the ashes of HIV/AIDS victims on the White House lawn because the Ronald Reagan administration refused to actually do anything. ACT UP also started their own healthcare research groups. So they brought in a lot of doctors, they brought in community health advocates, they brought in nurses, and literally were trying to create their own HIV/AIDS medications because, again, the federal government and drug companies refused to do it at the beginning of the outbreak. And they, had the medical expertise within their own group to really do that work. The San Francisco AIDS Foundation was also founded around this time, right? There were literally, like dozens and dozens and dozens of advocacy organizations that were self-created by the queer community in San Francisco to really respond to the HIV/AIDS crisis. And today I mentioned, you can see the Compton Cafeteria Riot plaque. It's on the cross streets of Turk and Taylor and the Tenderloin. So that plaque is still there to commemorate that history. There's also the LGBT Historical Society in San Francisco, which is a really great museum. They also have a separate archives building on Market Street, where you can learn more about the LGBT history of the Bay, but also kind of like the wider country. And then I also just wanted to highlight some organizations, that are local in the Bay Area in particular for you all to follow, to learn more. Excuse me. There's Transgender Law Center, which specifically supports trans folks with legal assistance, thinking about name and gender changes, thinking about challenging employment discrimination, thinking about, challenging housing discrimination, et cetera, et cetera. And then there's the two big LGBT centers. So in SF, obviously, you have the SF Center. And then in Oakland, you have the Oakland LGBT Center, as well as the Transgender District. So these are some organizations. Again, you all have access to these slides afterwards. So, feel free to check out these organizations. They're doing really great work in your communities. And I just want to highlight them. And really quickly, before we get to Q&A, I don't want to name why this work matters in terms of housing, right? Again, thinking about the work you all do at Compass, you are supporting unhoused people or people who are, on the brink of being unhoused, if you will. And this is an issue that this really disparately impacts LGBT people, particularly LGBT youth and LGBT people of color. So it's estimated that up to 40% of the homeless youth population is LGBTQ. That's 4 times the regular, like the non-LGBTQ population. So LGBTQ youth are 4 times more likely to be unhoused compared to the general youth population. And this is an issue that doesn't go away, once LGBT youth grow into adults. So all of this data is from the Williams Institute at UCLA, which is the premier kind of research hub for LGBT advocacy in the country. And they have done a report recently that has found some pretty alarming statistics about LGBT people and housing insecurity and our likelihood to face housing insecurity. So, a lot of non-LGBT adults own their home. Roughly 70% of non-LGBT adults own their own home. But for LGBT folks, that number is just under half. So, home ownership is much harder to access for queer people. A lot of that is about, living in poverty. Queer people are more likely to live in poverty. A lot of that is about banks denying loans to LGBT couples because, yes, that does still happen. And, so there's just some stats on home ownership. And then thinking about homelessness in particular, I named that LGBT youth are more likely to be homeless, apologies. But, there's a huge gap in services for transition age people. So folks that are no longer quote unquote youth necessarily, but aren't technically autonomous adults yet either. So that 18 to 25 age gap is really vulnerable. And I'm sure you all see this in your work, right? So young adults that are kind of in that in-between age gap are 2 times more likely to be homeless than non-LGBT young people in that same age range. And particularly for transgender people, there's even more barriers to accessing housing because oftentimes homeless shelters are not safe for trans people. There are really strict policies about gender, right, in a lot of homeless shelters, and that leaves out all our trans and non-binary folks. So, if you're a data nerd at all, or if you're just kind of looking for more information about the why and how LGBT adults and LGBT youth are more likely to be homeless, again, would definitely encourage you to check out the Williams Institute report. So I just want to end with some action steps. I think the most obvious ones are thinking about pronouns, that's the thing everyone talks about. And like a couple like misconceptions I want to clear up with the pronouns is like, one, people think that like only trans people use pronouns, which is like very hilarious and silly to me, because I'm like, we literally all use pronouns every single day, like whether you realize it or not, right? And like trans people did not invent pronouns. Pronouns are a function of speech that have existed for centuries, and not just the English language, but like across languages. So, you know, thinking about pronoun inclusion are really, I see a lot of you already have your pronouns in your Zoom chat. That is a great first step, right? Also doing that when you introduce yourself to people. So like typically if I meet someone new, either in real life or virtually, the first thing I'll say is like, hey, I'm Bryce, I use he, him pronouns. And usually that triggers one of two responses. People either know what I'm doing and they'll say, oh, hey, I'm Rex, I use he, him pronouns. Or they'll have no clue what I'm doing and they'll ask me like, oh, hey, Bryce, I'm curious, like, you know, what was that at the end of your introduction? Or why did you say your pronouns? And then that gives you a chance to kind of like do like a 10-second education moment, right? Where you're like, oh, I actually shared my pronouns because I want to make sure that I'm respecting everyone's identity, right? That's all you have to say. So like modeling pronoun inclusion is a really obvious first step. Again, it kind of creates like, it sets a tone, if you will, right, for inclusion across the board. And there's some examples of how you can do that in your email signature, just like having them right there. Again, it's helpful for people. And then thinking more on like an organizational level, there's like a lot of different action steps I could include here for organizations and individuals, but I want to make sure we have some time for Q&A. So I'm just kind of highlighting the big ones. But organizationally, you know, really thinking about like three things. Your HR policies, right? Like, are they LGBT inclusive? Are you offering LGBT inclusive healthcare insurance, trans inclusive healthcare insurance? Are your family planning policies gender neutral and inclusive of all parents, regardless of their gender, right? So like HR policies is a big one. Another one though is like data collection, right? Like how you're collecting data, both internally for your staff, but also for you all in particular, thinking about externally for your clients, right? So like when you're doing intakes, like on those intake forms, is there spaces for preferred names if it's different from their legal name? Is there spaces for pronouns, right? How are you capturing demographic data, again, of your internal team and also your external clients, right? So thinking about like data collection and like your forms is like another really big kind of like organizational step. And then finally, I'll just name that like having really clear policies around like harassment, bullying, that sort of thing, and like workplace, because it does happen. Like you might be saying bullying, we're adults, this isn't school. Workplace bullying is still a huge issue, especially for folks in marginalized communities. So like if you have policies around kind of like your code of conduct or whatnot, you know, are those LGBT inclusive? Meaning, you know, are you specifically naming like, hey, at X, Y, and Z organization, you know, we will not tolerate, you know, bullying, harassment, microaggressions against people because of these identities. And like in policy world, they call that enumeration. When you enumerate a policy, you list out specifically, you know, who the most marginalized or most impacted people are. So that's another thing to think about organizationally, just like, are your policies, whether it's about harassment or discrimination or about any other like aspect of your company culture, are those policies enumerated with really specifically naming, you know, hey, we are protecting these groups of people that are most marginalized in this society. So I know I just said a lot really quickly. So one, I really appreciate you all being here and sticking around. And I hope you were able to like get something out of it. And I would love to, you know, spend some time just like answering any questions you all have, either about kind of like workplace equity, my own story, what it means to be trans, or any of like the statistics or topics that I highlighted today.
Thank you, Bryce, so much. For those of you that are willing and able, if you would just give Bryce a round of applause for his scholarship, his research. So I'm going to make this really simple. In the chat, I have dropped several times the post-event survey. We want that data. Bryce wants that data. So please make sure that you take a few moments to do that. And I want to open it up. So feel free to use the reactions button at the bottom of Zoom if you'd like to raise your hand, or if you're just interested in dropping your question in the chat, because maybe you don't want people to hear your voice. That's okay too. I will raise your question. Bryce, you just got a great presentation from our CEO, Erica. So thank you, Erica, so much.
Thanks, Erica.
Is there anyone that has a question, comment, feedback for Bryce? Frida, Frida said as a non-binary staff person, they appreciate you so much for coming, Bryce. So absolutely, Frida. And we appreciate you being dressed as a crayon today. Lovely. I absolutely have to hop off, but no, so happy. Thank you for coming. Anybody, feel free to take yourself off mute. And let's ask Bryce some. Bryce, this is from Mick, our Director of People and Culture. Can you explain the difference between gender identity and sexual orientation?
Oh, yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. That does often get conflated, a lot. I joke that I kind of like come out as every letter on the LGBT spectrum. But so, when I'll give you like an example from my own life. My mom had a really hard time when I first came out as trans. We're good now. She's all good now. But the first few years were a bit rocky, to say the least. And one of the first things my mom told me when I came out to her as trans when I was like 18 or 19, my mom was like, oh, so this means you're straight now, right? Because like at the time I had a girlfriend and like all that jazz. And I was like, no, Mom, that's not really how this works. Like, I'm still like, yes, I identify like, I use he, him pronouns now. Like, yes, I identify as masculine, but like, this doesn't mean that I'm like straight now, right? So like, a really like easy way to explain this, you might have seen one of my favorite old school graphics, the genderbread person. Actually, this is if I can pull it up. And the genderbread person, has like, it explains like the difference between all of this, and it has a little heart in the head, right? So like your gender expression or your gender identity is more like in your brain, right? It's like who you are, versus like your sexual orientation is like your heart, right? And it's like who you love, right? Or who you're attracted to. I'm gonna find, here we go. And so, yeah, so like myself, for example, like I identify as queer, right? In terms of my sexual orientation, which for me, like the word queer means different things to different people, right? It's one of those kind of like flexible umbrella words. But for me, being queer in terms of my sexual orientation means that like I predominantly date and am predominantly attracted to women. But, I've dated people across the gender binary and across the gender spectrum, and I've been attracted to people across the gender spectrum, trans men, cisgender men, trans women even. So like, I think for myself, the word queer feels good because it's like all encapsulating, right? Like I'm just attracted to people. It's less to me about like your gender identity and more about like, hey, do we vibe? Do we get along? Like, all that stuff. So yeah, sexual orientation is again, like really about like, you can see in the gender by person image, like the heart, the little attraction piece, right? It's like, who are you attracted to? Who are you romantically attracted to? Versus gender identity or gender expression is more about like who you are, right? So I hope that kind of like answered that question with some assistance from the gender by person, obviously.
Great answer, great question. Thank you, Mick. Does anybody else have a question for Bryce? Please don't be shy. Drop it in the chat, or I will.
Oh yeah, I've heard everything before. So like, I promise you, like you won't offend me or make me upset. And if it is a question that is like kind of questionable, I'll still answer it, and I'll tell you like I will answer this, but you should not ask other trans people this. But generally, I will answer anything.
Excellent.
I see a thumbs up from Raul. I don't know if that means he has a question, but.
Yeah, Raul, I don't know if you are thumb upping the gingerbread person or but if you'd like to come off mute, you can. I think your thumbs up has left. Oh, there you go,
yeah.
Please.
No, I was just agreeing with what Bryce was saying.
Oh, okay, cool.
We appreciate the cosign. Anyone else? Does anyone have a question? I see some of your faces. You look like, I want to ask a question, but I don't want to ask first. Feel free to drop it in the chat. If you have a question, I will ask it for you. Bryce, you got a great job. Really like the chair analogy from earlier from your colleague.
Thank you.
I know something, Bryce, that I would love to get your perspective on. I know that you have, and this isn't a political event, but as you talked about the over 200 plus anti-LGBT bills, when you think about the midterm election coming up, actually in a couple of days, what do you believe folks' civic responsibility is to get out and combat and make their voices heard about fighting these really anti and regressive policies?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really important. You know, it's honestly like the biggest thing. A question I get a lot is like, well, how can people be an ally to trans people in particular? And like the biggest thing is like, if you consider yourself an ally to trans people in any capacity right now, to really like go out there and one, vote, just like vote, period. But two, like, you know, to really like to really take time to like learn more about like what's happening in your specific community or like your specific state when it comes to these like anti-LGBT bills. I'm trying to find, I thought I had like a resource slide that had like links to the bills, but I can send you some but I think the biggest thing right now is just like, yeah, like being like a really vocal, like being really vocal about like where you stand on those anti-LGBT bills, right? A lot of these bills, you know, are literally going after kids. Like we're talking about children who just like want to play sports on sports teams, children who just want to be able to access healthcare, right? And healthcare that has been researched, been studied, been deemed as safe, right? And like a lot of these bills are like literally criminalizing their parents, criminalizing providers who are healthcare providers or therapists. So yeah, I think the biggest thing is just like, if you're an ally to trans people, being really vocal about that, like saying it to your friends, your neighbors, especially if these conversations come up, especially around voting time, you know, really reminding folks like, I think it's like easy to get really jaded when it comes to politics, especially these days, right? But like reminding folks that like you're voting ultimately for your communities, right? Like for people in your communities, like regardless of if they're trans or not, because again, thinking about all the marginalized communities that are your neighbors, your friends, right? Like those are the people you're voting for ultimately at the end of the day. So yeah, I think that's the biggest thing. It's just like, if you're a trans ally, like we really need more cis people to be vocal right now about like, hey, I support transgender people, this is why, or like, hey, I have trans people in my lives. And like when you say things like that, or when you support policies or support politicians that support those policies, it's really harmful and here's why, right? So, you know, take the time to do your own research, take the time to check out the resource links I have here, but also there's just like so many great resources out there. If any of you are specifically interested in learning more about this piece of the work, I actually would recommend you all check out the Equality Federation. So the Equality Federation is a national LGBT organization, and they do the best policy work when it comes to LGBT policy advocacy. And they actually have a legislative tracker. So I'm showing it to you right now on their website, where you can go and track all of the bills that are impacting LGBT people across the country, not just the anti-trans ones, but all of them. And you can track them state by state. So like, you might be saying, oh, well, this is California, we're this great progressive state, right? There are currently 39 bills in California, as you can see. And then if you click California, it will like literally take you bill by bill by bill, and it will tell you you know, who introduced that bill. It will give you a rundown of it, if it's a positive bill, if it's a negative bill. So yeah, just like voting right now is so critical, but just outside of voting, just like being a vocal ally for trans people, it's like the biggest thing that we need right now in terms of like what we need from cisgender people is to like stand up and like talk to your friends and neighbors and families that you support trans people.
Thank you so much for that. I really appreciate you all for registering, attending, and staying with us.
Yeah.
If you're interested, you can follow Bryce on LinkedIn. You can follow Swarm Strategy. You can also follow Compass Family Services on Eventbrite, as we will be posting more events as we round out the year, doing something in November for Native American or Indigenous Heritage Month, and then following it up in December as we commemorate National Homeless Persons Memorial Day. Thank you all so much for attending. I appreciate you. Bryce, thank you for your time. I hope that everybody has a fantastic day, and happy Halloween. Bye, everybody.
Yes, it's been